My grandfather died without leaving a will. Overnight, everything I had built with him slipped into my father's hands. He sneered at me across the room, his voice cutting sharper than any blade. "You won't get a single cent. Your brother will be the next heir." I thought that was the end, that the legacy I'd bled for was gone. But then, on a storm-soaked night, a stranger pressed an envelope into my hands and whispered, "It's time to tell them who you really are." Inside that envelope was something I never imagined, something powerful enough to tear my family apart. My name is Avery Whitaker. I'm 30 years old and I've lived in Boston my entire life. It's a city that never lets you forget where you came from. Brick row houses press shoulder to shoulder, the Charles River cutting through with its calm current, the sound of trolley bells still echoing on certain streets. Some people find the city too cold, too blunt. For me, it's always been the backdrop of every memory I carry, both the ones that make me proud and the ones that still sting. I grew up in a family that had money, but we weren't the type who flaunted it with yachts or diamond-studded galas. At least that's how it was when my grandfather was alive. His name was Thomas Whitaker. To most people, he was a decorated veteran and the founder of Whitaker and Daughters, a respected construction and real estate company in Massachusetts. To me, he was simply Grandpa. He was the person who walked me to school when my dad was too busy, the one who sat at the kitchen table, teaching me how to balance numbers in a ledger, long before I even understood what credit and debt really meant. He was tall, always standing with a kind of quiet strength that drew people in. Even when he got older, his voice carried this steady authority, never loud, never sharp, but firm enough that you listened. I remember sitting by his chair while he polished an old brass compass he carried from his days in the service. He'd say, "Avery, honor is your true north. If you lose that, you're lost no matter how much you think you've gained." At the time, I thought it was just one of those sayings old people repeat. Years later, those words came back to me like a lifeline. My father, Charles, was a different story. He had the charm, the suits, the practiced smile that could disarm strangers in an instant. But beneath that was a man I never really trusted. Where my grandfather saw the company as a legacy, my father saw it as leverage. Something to grow his influence, expand his circle. Buy himself the right kind of respect. He liked expensive watches, long weekends on Martha's Vineyard, and deals that were whispered over cocktails instead of signed in daylight. He wasn't a father in the true sense. He was more like a shadow looming in the background, reminding me that one day I'd either fall in line with his way or be shoved aside. Then there was Blake, my younger brother. 4 years younger, to be exact. If Charles had a mirror image, it was Blake. Spoiled restless, always chasing the next party or the next person who would feed his ego. He worked at the company in title, only showing up late to meetings, leaving early for networking events that were really just bar nights with friends. I tried for a long time to be patient with him, to remember he was my brother. But there's only so much you can ignore when someone keeps laughing at responsibilities you've carried on your shoulders since you were 25. Because yes, at 25, I was named CEO of Whitaker and Daughters. My grandfather believed in me that much. He called me into his office, a room that always smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco, and said, "It's time, Avery. I trust you to keep this company standing strong." I still remember the pride in his eyes when he slid the nameplate across the desk to me. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, but because I was determined. I threw myself into work, learning everything from the ground up. I spent long nights at construction sites, boots covered in dust, asking questions until the foreman got tired of me. I went over contracts line by line until I knew the language better than half the lawyers we paid. We weren't perfect, but under my leadership, we landed projects other firms couldn't touch. I remember one in particular, a waterfront development in Quincy that nearly fell apart when a competitor undercut us with shady promises. Instead of giving up, I flew out to meet the investors myself. I told them what we could do, why it mattered, and how we'd deliver. It took 3 sleepless nights of revising plans and presentations, but we won them over. My grandfather showed up at the office the next day, hugged me in front of the staff, and whispered, "I knew you could carry this." That memory, I still hold it close. It's one of the few times I felt completely seen. But for every step forward I took, my father seemed to pull 2 steps back. He wasn't running the company, but he liked to parade around as if he was the reason for our success. He courted donors, politicians, and anyone who could pad his network. Blake followed suit, bragging about deals he didn't close and clients he didn't win. And through it all, I kept grinding, trying to protect what my grandfather built. I thought if I just worked harder, if I just stayed true, eventually my father and Blake would understand. Looking back now, I realize how naive that was. Some people don't want to understand. They only want to take. And in a family like mine, that truth comes at a cost. The week after my grandfather's funeral felt like someone had pulled the ground out from under me. I was still trying to make sense of his absence when my father called a shareholders meeting at Whitaker and Daughters. I remember walking into that glass conference room on the 18th floor, Boston Harbor, visible behind him, the morning fog rolling in so thick it blurred the skyline. The board sat in a neat line, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. Charles cleared his throat and smiled that politician's smile. "We're entering a new chapter," he said. "My daughter Avery has done her part, but it's time for change." Then he gestured toward Blake, who smirked like a child about to unwrap a gift. "My son will take on a greater leadership role." I sat there stunned, my palms sweating against the polished wood of the table. I had bled for this company. I had carried it through storms. And here he was, cutting me off with a sentence. "Avery," he said, turning his eyes to me. "You've worked hard, but the company no longer needs you, no longer needs me." The words echoed louder than the muffled horns of ships outside. My mouth went dry. The silence in that room was suffocating. A couple of board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Not one person who had seen me grind day and night stood by me. I gathered my things, my notebook, my pen, and walked out. Not in anger, not in defiance, just hollow. My heels clicked against the marble floor of the lobby, each step sounding like the end of something I wasn't ready to let go of. For days I drifted. My apartment in South End suddenly felt foreign, like a place I didn't belong. I stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, listening to the hum of the old radiator, wondering how everything unraveled so quickly. I sent out resumes, but Boston is a small city in the construction world. Rumors spread fast, and I heard them whispers that I was difficult, that I'd been pushed out for underperforming. Lies planted carefully. One night, my phone buzzed with a message from a friend in the industry. "Avery, I don't know how to say this, but your dad's been calling around. He's making sure nobody hires you." I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the phone, my stomach twisting. It wasn't enough that he'd taken the company. He wanted to erase me. The humiliation only deepened when I agreed to attend a gathering at his house in Beacon Hill. Part of me hoped I could still be civil, that maybe I'd find a sliver of family left. The mansion smelled of aged wine and expensive candles. Chandeliers cast warm light over polished silver trays. Blake stood in the center, surrounded by guests bragging about a new marketing strategy. I knew it was work his team had done without him, but no one cared. They clapped, toasted, raised their glasses. Then Blake spotted me. "Avery!" he called out loudly, drawing everyone's attention. "I heard you're working construction sites now. Fitting, isn't it?" Laughter rippled through the room. Heat rushed to my face. I wanted to shout to remind them who had saved the company from collapse, but my throat locked. Charles stepped in, patting Blake's shoulder like a proud coach. "Don't mind her," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Your brother is the future of this family. Everything, the company, this house, even the yacht will be yours one day." That was the knife. Not just the words, but the way he said them so casually, as if I was invisible. I set down my glass of water and left without saying goodbye. Outside, the February air cut sharp against my cheeks, and for the first time, I felt like I no longer belonged anywhere. The days blurred. I picked up odd jobs to survive, driving deliveries, waiting tables, even scrubbing drywall dust off unfinished condos. Each time I passed a rising building, I thought of my grandfather, of the pride he carried when we looked at a completed project together. It hurt like a physical wound. Then the shadows started. A man standing across the street from my apartment, his face hidden beneath a baseball cap. A black car idling near the construction site where I delivered materials. I told myself I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew. My father wanted me quiet, maybe even gone. And then came the night that changed everything. Rain hammered the pavement, slicking the streets, making the neon signs blur into smudges of color. I ducked into a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, exhausted from another delivery shift. The place smelled of burnt beans and damp coats, almost empty, except for a couple whispering at the counter. That's when he walked in. Tall silver hair peeking out from under a battered cap coat, frayed at the seams. His eyes were sharp cold like they'd seen too much. He scanned the room, then walked straight to my table. Avery Whitaker. His voice was low, gravelly. I gripped my cup tighter, nodding. "I'm Caleb Rourke," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I knew your grandfather." The name didn't ring a bell, but something in his tone froze me. He reached into his coat and pulled out a brown envelope sealed with red wax. He placed it on the table, pressing his hand over it for a moment, before letting go. "Your grandfather gave this to me before he died. He told me to deliver it to you personally. He didn't trust his lawyer. He didn't trust your father." My breath caught. "What's in it?" "Open it when you're alone," he said, his eyes flicking toward the door. "And be careful. There are people who don't want you to see what's inside." Then he stood, tugging his cap lower. "One more thing," he added quietly. "It's time to tell them who you really are." Before I could ask anything, he left, disappearing into the rain. I sat there staring at the envelope. It felt heavier than paper should. My grandfather's handwriting marked the front, and I swear for a second I could almost hear his voice again. My hands trembled as I tucked it into my coat. Whatever was inside, it was the first glimmer of hope I'd had in months. And maybe, just maybe, the start of a war I wasn't sure I was ready to fight. I didn't open the envelope right away. I carried it back to my apartment, the rain soaking through my coat, the city lights smearing across the windshield as if Boston itself was holding its breath. When I finally locked the door behind me, I sat at my kitchen table, the radiator clanking in the corner, and laid the envelope down in front of me. My fingers shook as I broke the red wax seal. Inside were 3 items: a folded document, a handwritten letter, and a small USB drive. I unfolded the document first. My heart thudded as I read the header, "Last Will and Testament of Thomas Whitaker." It was meticulous, typed and notarized, bearing his signature. According to it, every share of Whitaker and Daughters along with his estate was left to me. Not my father, not Blake me. I read the lines twice, then 3 times, tears blurring the words. He hadn't lied. He had meant what he told me all those years, the company, the legacy it was mine to protect. Next, I opened the letter. His handwriting was a little shaky, but unmistakable. "Avery, if you are reading this, it means things did not go as I hoped. I trust you, but I do not trust those around me. Hold on to what I taught you. Do not let them take what is yours. I have always been proud of you." I pressed the paper against my chest, my breath breaking. For the first time since his death, I felt like he was still with me, guiding me. Finally, I plugged the USB into my laptop. There was one audio file. I hit play, and my grandfather's voice filled the room, frail but steady. "Avery, I don't trust Martin Cole, and I fear your father will do whatever it takes to take Whitaker and Daughters. If something happens, find Caleb. He will know what to do." When the recording ended, I just sat there staring at the screen. My whole body was trembling, part fear, part relief. I had proof, not enough to march into court tomorrow, but enough to know I wasn't crazy. My father and Martin had lied. They'd stolen what wasn't theirs. But how was I supposed to fight them? They had money connections power. I had an envelope. The next morning, I made an appointment with Sophie Ellison, a lawyer who specialized in estate cases. Her office was downtown, a narrow building with glass walls overlooking Tremont Street. She greeted me with a firm handshake, sharp eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses. "Show me what you've got," she said. I laid everything out, the copy of the will, the letter, the USB. I told her everything about Caleb, about the missing will, about my father's threats. Sophie listened quietly, taking notes. When I finished, she leaned back, folding her hands. "Avery, this is significant," she said, "but it's not enough. A copy of a will is valuable, but the court needs the original. The letter and the recording support your story, but they're circumstantial. We need hard evidence that the original will existed and was deliberately hidden or destroyed." My stomach sank. So what do I do? We investigate. People talk. Paper trails exist. Find someone who worked with Martin Cole who might have seen the original. I'll handle the legal side. You need to be careful. If your father is behind this, he won't let you dig quietly. Her words hit like a warning bell. But I nodded. I wasn't going to stop. That's when I reached out to Nate Hargrove, a private investigator recommended by a friend. Nate was in his 40s, short but sharp-eyed, with the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen too many ugly truths. We met in a diner in Cambridge, the kind with sticky booths and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. "What do you need?" he asked, flipping open a notebook. "Financial records," I said. "Any large withdrawals from my father's accounts around the time my grandfather died? Anything that could look like hush money." Nate nodded slowly. "And if I find something, then we use it to prove what they did." He scribbled a note. "Give me a week." That week, I kept digging on my own. I remembered Marissa Hale, Martin Cole's secretary, years ago. She'd always been polite to me when I visited with Grandpa. I reached out, and after a few ignored texts, she finally agreed to meet at a small cafe near Quincy Market. When she walked in, she looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be following her. "Avery," she said quietly, sitting down. "I don't know if I should be here. I need the truth, Marissa. Did you ever see my grandfather's will?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it was in Martin's safe. I didn't read it, but I saw the signature. After your grandfather passed, it disappeared. When I asked about it, Martin told me it wasn't my business. I felt my pulse spike. And my father. Did you see him there?" She swallowed. "He came by a few times before it went missing." They whispered in Martin's office. He looked tense. I reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Thank you." Her eyes darted to the door. "Be careful, Avery. They don't want this coming out." I left with my heart racing. Proof was out there, I could feel it. But danger was close too. That night, I noticed the same black car parked outside my apartment. Its engine idled for an hour before it finally drove off. My skin crawled. A few days later, I found an envelope slid under my door. Inside was a single note scrawled in thick black ink, "Be smart. Leave Boston." I sat on the floor staring at it, fear mixing with rage. They wanted me gone. But if they thought threats would scare me, they didn't know me at all. And then just as I was convincing myself I could handle this alone, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me. 10 p.m., Rusty Nail Bar. It's about Charles Whitaker." I read it twice, my heart pounding. Rusty Nail was a dive on the edge of town, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. It could be a trap. But what if it wasn't? What if it was the missing piece I needed? I stared at the glowing screen in the dark, knowing one thing: whatever waited for me at that bar could change everything or end it. Rusty Nail was the kind of bar you avoided unless you had no choice. Neon lights flickered above the cracked doorway, half the letters burned out, so the sign just read, "Rust and Ill." The floor smelled of stale beer and bleach, the kind of combination that made you want to keep your shoes on. I got there 10 minutes early, sliding into a corner booth near the emergency exit. My pulse hammered. Every person who walked in made me tense. At exactly 10 sur, the door creaked open. A figure stepped in. Hood pulled low. For a second, I thought it was another setup, but when they pulled the hood back, my breath caught. Blake. He looked different. His hair was unkempt, his eyes red. Not the smug brother I knew. He sat down across from me, his hands trembling as he shoved a stack of papers across the table. "I can't keep doing this," he whispered. "Dad's gone too far." I scanned the papers, emails, between my father and Martin Cole. Words like payment, handle it permanently, and the one that made my blood freeze, ensure she never gets a chance. I looked up. You stole these, I copied them off. Dad's computer, Blake admitted. I thought I wanted the money, the company. But not like this. He's planning to ruin you completely. Maybe worse. I don't want you dead, Avery. I studied his face, waiting for the smirk, the sarcasm, the betrayal. But what I saw was fear, real fear. Why now? I asked, my voice low. Because I was wrong, Blake said, his voice cracking. I don't want to be him. I don't want his blood on my hands. I slid the papers back toward me, folding them into my bag. My throat felt tight. I didn't know if I could trust him, but I knew I couldn't ignore what he'd given me. Then help me, I said. He nodded, eyes darting to the door. But be careful. Dad already knows you're digging. He won't stop. We left separately. As I drove home, the papers burning like fire in my bag, I realized the fight was about to reach the only place that mattered, a courtroom. The probate court in Boston wasn't glamorous. No marble statues or grand staircases, just dark wood paneling, tall windows that let in slants of cold light, and the smell of old paper baked into the walls. But to me, it felt like an arena. My father sat on the other side of the aisle, sharp in his tailored suit, his face a mask of control. Beside him, Martin Cole adjusted his glasses, the picture of calm, though his fingers clenched tightly in his lap. I sat with Sophie, my lawyer, every nerve in my body on edge. She touched my arm. Remember, we only need to show enough to reopen the case. Let the evidence speak. When the judge entered the room, stood. She was a middle-aged woman with a steady gaze that didn't waver. We are here regarding the estate of Thomas Whitaker, she said. Counsel, proceed. Sophie rose. Your Honor, we believe the original will of Thomas Whitaker was deliberately concealed. My client, his granddaughter, presents evidence that supports this claim. She began methodically handing the clerk documents, the copy of the will, the handwritten letter, the USB with the recording. The judge leaned forward as Sophie continued. This letter was written in Mr. Whitaker's own hand, expressing distrust of his attorney, Mr. Cole. The recording you will hear echoes that distrust and names his son, Charles Whitaker, as someone who might attempt to seize the company. Martin stood, his voice smooth. Your Honor, with respect, these are sentimental items, copies without legal validity. We should not tarnish reputations over fabrications. Sophie's voice sharpened. Then how do you explain this? She held up the printed emails Blake had given me, correspondence between Charles Whitaker and Martin Cole, discussing payments and how to ensure Ms. Whitaker never sees the will. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sophie pressed on. We also present testimony from Marissa Hale, Mr. Cole's former secretary, who personally saw the original will before it vanished. Marissa, pale but steady, took the stand. I saw it in his safe. It had Mr. Whitaker's signature. After his death, it disappeared. The judge's gaze turned to Martin. He shifted uncomfortably, wiping sweat from his brow. Then Sophie called Nate. He produced financial records showing 2 large cash withdrawals from my father's account, $65,000 right after my grandfather's death and $40,000  2 months later. Payments, Nate said firmly, that coincide with the disappearance of the will and the harassment of Caleb Rourke. Martin's face went ashen. My father gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Finally, Sophie looked toward the door. Your Honor, we request one more witness. The doors opened. Caleb walked in, older and wearier than the last time I'd seen him, but his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. In his hand, he held the brass compass my grandfather used to polish. He took the oath, then spoke in a voice rough but steady. Thomas Whitaker was my comrade. He gave me this compass in the war. Before he died, he entrusted me with a copy of his will. He said he feared his lawyer would betray him, that his son would destroy what he built. He told me to deliver it to Avery. The courtroom went silent. The judge's eyes flicked to the compass, its face glinting in the afternoon light. Why the compass, she asked. Caleb lifted it. because he always said honor is your true north. He wanted Avery to find her way. Sophie pressed play on the USB. My grandfather's voice filled the courtroom, frail but resolute. I don't trust Martin Cole. I fear my son will take everything. Avery must be the one to carry this legacy. The sound of his voice broke something in me. Tears filled my eyes, but I kept them fixed on my father. For the first time, I saw his confidence crack. He lowered his gaze, his lips pressed tight. The judge leaned back, her voice firm. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds sufficient grounds to suspect fraud and concealment. We order a criminal investigation into Charles Whitaker and Martin Cole. The probate case will be reopened once that investigation is complete. Her gavel struck. The sound echoed like thunder in my chest. Sophie touched my arm again. "We did it," she whispered. But as I watched my father stand, his face pale, his eyes burning into me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. That night, back in my apartment, I set the compass on my table. Its needle pointed north, steady and unwavering. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel: hope. But hope doesn't erase danger. My father had power, and men like him didn't go down quietly. The fight was far from over, and deep down, I knew he would come for me again. The weeks after the court's decision felt like a storm refusing to settle. News outlets in Boston lit up with headlines: "Inheritance Scandal at Whitaker and Daughters." For years, my father had been painted as a man of influence, a figure who mingled with senators and bankers. Now his face was plastered on front pages, under words like fraud and deception. I tried not to read every article, but they were everywhere on newsstands, in the hands of subway riders, flashing across TV screens, in every cafe I stepped into. Neighbors looked at me differently, some offering nods of support, others whispering as I walked past. That was the price of dragging family secrets into the light. The criminal trial came first. My father sat at the defense table, looking smaller somehow, his tailored suit hanging looser on him than before. Martin Cole sat beside him, dabbing sweat from his forehead even before the judge entered. The prosecutors laid out the case financial records of suspicious withdrawals testimony from Marissa, the emails Blake had provided, and Caleb's account of being hunted for holding the will. Piece by piece, the facade my father built crumbled. Blake took the stand. My brother, who had once mocked me in front of a crowd, now spoke with a voice that shook, but carried the truth. He admitted to hearing conversations between Dad and Martin, admitted to stealing the emails because he feared things would go too far. He didn't look at me when he testified, maybe too ashamed. But in that moment, I didn't feel anger, only a quiet ache for the years we had wasted as siblings. When the verdict came, the gavel hit with a sound that felt like the closing of a heavy door. Martin was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in concealing the will and obstructing justice. My father received 3 years with the possibility of parole if he cooperated. For a man who once commanded rooms with his presence, seeing him led away in handcuffs was surreal. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated. Another part only felt tired. Afterward, the probate case reopened. With the copy of the will, the supporting evidence, and the criminal conviction of those who tampered with it, the judge recognized my grandfather's true intentions. The company, the estate, the legacy, all of it was restored to me. But victory didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like standing on a battlefield after the smoke cleared, staring at ruins. Whitaker and Daughters had suffered. Contracts were broken. Partners walked away. Employees resigned under the cloud of scandal. Walking into the headquarters on Tremont Street for the first time as chairwoman, I felt the weight of silence in the hallways. Desks stood empty, files stacked in corners, the hum of computers echoing in rooms once filled with laughter and late-night collaboration. I gathered the remaining staff in the main conference room. Their faces were wary, a mix of loyalty and exhaustion. I didn't give them a speech about profits or market share. Instead, I told them what my grandfather had told me, that buildings were not just concrete and steel, but legacies of fairness and responsibility. that we weren't going to rebuild the company on secrecy and manipulation, but on trust. Some looked doubtful, but others nodded slowly, as if remembering what the Whitaker name once meant. I started small. We restructured management cutting ties with contractors who had thrived under my father's favoritism. I hired independent auditors, invited back employees who had left under pressure, and set up a fund in my grandfather's name dedicated to worker safety on construction sites. It wasn't glamorous and it didn't make headlines, but it was real. And then there was Blake. The court spared him because of his cooperation. When the dust settled, he came to me one evening at the office. He looked younger, stripped of the arrogance he used to wear like armor. "I don't deserve a place here," he admitted. I studied him for a long time before answering. Maybe not. But Grandpa believed in giving people chances to change. If you want to prove you're different, start at the bottom. No titles, no shortcuts. You'll earn your way like everyone else. He nodded, eyes down, and whispered, "Thank you." For once, I believed he meant it. One evening after weeks of endless work, I walked through the main lobby. The building was still scarred, cracked paint, half-lit bulbs, but it felt alive again. At the far wall, my grandfather's portrait hung his steady eyes, watching over us. I paused beneath it, holding the brass compass Caleb had returned to me. Its face glinted under the dim lights, its needle unwavering. I thought about everything we had lost and everything we still had left to fight for. The next morning, I had a glass case installed in the lobby. Inside, I placed the compass mounted on a small plaque engraved with 2 words, "True North." It wasn't for me. It was for everyone who walked through those doors, a reminder that legacy isn't built on greed or lies, but on something far harder to hold honor. Sometimes when I stand beneath that case and watch employees pass by, I catch myself wondering about my father. Does he regret what he did? Does he think about the nights we sat at the dinner table pretending we were a family? Maybe. Maybe not. But regret doesn't undo choices. And my choice now is to carry forward what my grandfather trusted me with, no matter how heavy it feels. Boston at night is a strange comfort. The river glimmers under the lights, the air sharp with salt and wind. I walk along the waterfront sometimes, letting the city's pulse steady me. I don't know what challenges lie ahead. There will always be competitors, critics, maybe even ghosts of my family's mistakes. But I'm not afraid anymore. I lost almost everything. Yet in that loss, I found clarity. I found my true north. And that compass glinting quietly in its glass case tells me every day I am exactly where I need to be. Looking back, I sometimes wonder how different things could have been if my father had chosen honor over greed, if Blake had spoken up sooner, if my grandfather had lived long enough to protect his wishes himself. But life doesn't deal in what-ifs. It deals in choices. Theirs nearly destroyed me. Mine kept me standing. I walk through the halls of Whitaker and Daughters, now hearing the steady rhythm of work, returning voices, echoing against walls that once felt hollow. And every time I pass that glass case in the lobby, the compass reminds me that legacy isn't about money or power. It's about the direction you choose when no one is watching. I can't erase the betrayals. I can't undo the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd lost everything. But I can choose what comes next. And for me, that means carrying my grandfather's values into every brick we lay, every deal we sign. Honor is my true north. And no one, not even my own family, will ever take that away again. If this story resonated with you, don't just stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter of betrayal, truth, and redemption. Leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever seen greed tear a family apart? And if you found yourself in my shoes, what choice would you make? Your voice matters, and every story reminds us honor is worth more than money.